Hi, I'm Sumaya here from the University of the Witwatersrand, South Africa. I will be presenting on a project that I am working on with my colleagues Justin August and James Takalani on personality structure in South Africa. This research was partially funded by the National Research Foundation of South Africa. So essentially, we were interested in looking at the big five or the five factors and to see to what extent that replicated in the South African context. Primarily because there is lots of research evidence that says that the five factors are universal. If we look at the seminal studies by McCree and Terracciano from 2005 across 50 cultures, as well as church, the evidence does stack up to say that the big five are universal. But if we look more closely at McCree and Terracciano and colleagues, we'll note that the African countries had the lowest reliability and congruence coefficients in that study. We'll also note that there were very few African countries which were included in that study in comparison to countries outside of Africa and Asia. Not only looking at McCree and Terracciano or Church, but looking across the broad body of literature that has collected over the years on the Big Five, we find that the evidence is less conclusive in African and Asian cultures. We find that the five factors are not wholly applicable, with extroversion and openness being the least replicable of the factors. Lahair basically summarizes a lot of the African research in that paper. We also find that with the most recent evidence emerging from instruments like the South African Personality Inventory, the Cross-Cultural Personality Inventory by Chung et al., as well as the recent work being done by Thalmaya and colleagues in Namibia in Kukugawab, that the five factors are actually not complete. There are other factors. So with the SAPI, the researchers found that the five factors could be replicated, but there were actually 9 factors that were found in the SAPI. 5 similar to the 5 factors and 4 others. With the CPA-I2, Chung found 4 factors, which when compared to the 5 factors, the model could be replicated, the least replicable of which was the openness factor, which Ted refers to as well. And Amber Thalmaya and colleagues found in the Kukugawab that there was a more communal element as well as a more spiritual element that was not necessarily incorporated in the 5-factor model. So why these big differences? I think it's important to acknowledge that the 5-factor model was developed in the English lexicon, and as pointed out, most research on the 5 factors were in weird samples. In fact, across the board, if we look at a lot of research that's being conducted across psychology, personality psychology also part of that, Thalmaya and colleagues have recently published to say that 89% of research in top-tier medical journals was still conducted by American or European researchers using weird samples. So our research aimed to take the NEO-PIR, which is the gold standard measure of the five-factor model or the Big Five, and it was the one that was used in the study by McCree and Terracciano. And we wanted to see if we could find the reliability and using exploratory factor analysis with varimax rotation, again, methods used in that study, if we would find evidence for the 5 factors. And we were going to do that in a South African context, but slightly different from other South African studies that may have been conducted prior to that. We were doing ours across 3 provinces in South Africa. So that's us at the bottom of Africa. And if you were to look at our country, it's made up of 9 provinces. We used Gauteng, which is our most populous urban province, and then we used 2 rural provinces, the Eastern Cape and then the Limpopo. And we said, let's see how this instrument stacks up. So we had convenient samples across the board, but decent sizes across Gauteng and Eastern Cape. We used student samples as well as community samples for obvious reasons. The instrument we used was the NEO, and we did the Cronbach Alpha and EFA. In terms of our student sample results, if we just look at the reliabilities, we'll see a steady decrease as we move from Gauteng to the Eastern Cape and then to Limpopo. We see a decrease in the overall reliability coefficients for each of the 5 factors, but we also see strong decreases in terms of the facets. With Gauteng students, all the facets exceeded 0.6. With the EC students, we could get them between 5 and 0.59 for majority of the facets except for the ones listed. And then the facet reliabilities in Limpopo were really poor, with only 3 facets having coefficients between zero point 0.5 and 0.55. If we look at the community samples, we were unable, unfortunately, to collect in Limpopo because as we were about to collect, COVID hit and our funding has not rolled over. So we're still hoping that we'll collect in Limpopo in the next few months. In terms of our community samples, the overall reliabilities are generally better, even better than the student samples for both regions. But in terms of the facet reliabilities, we could only get them between 0.5 and 0.59 for the facets, and there were a few of those that were under that as well. We look at validity results using the EFA in terms of student samples, and these are student samples from all English-speaking universities. So in terms of the student samples, we found evidence or support for the 5 factors, except for extroversion, which didn't load as expected in Gauteng, but in the Eastern Cape, but more so in Gauteng. When we look at the community samples, we found evidence for the 5 factors, and they loaded quite well in our Gauteng samples. So that's our urban populous province, but they didn't load as expected in the Eastern Cape, with extroversion, openness to experience, and agreeableness giving us the worst loadings in that regard. So what does this mean? For preliminary results, this is already telling us that we have support for the 5 factors. So it's not to say, that the 5 factors don't have any universality, but we do find huge variation, and you saw that across the factor loadings for the factors, depending on which province we were in. We also find that the expression of those factors with the facets used were particularly poor in the Eastern Cape and Limpopo. So provinces that were not as populous or urban as Gauteng, and where English is spoken but not as widely as in Gauteng. We also found the evidence was stronger in student samples, where English was stronger and who would have probably approximated Western samples, but not so much in community samples. So we found cross-loadings, especially for extroversion facets across samples. And we also found that, particularly in Eastern Cape, our rural province, openness, extroversion, and agreeableness did not replicate. Why would this be so? I've been touching on it. So we have the rural versus urban. And in terms of rural versus urban, our rural cultures are more the traditional African cultures. We still find that people still live together in communities. There's still small villages. English, majority of South Africa is second language English speakers, but in Gauteng, everybody really communicates in English, whereas in Eastern Cape and Limpopo, you'll still find traditional languages are more common. You also find that in our more rural provinces, they are very much less resource comparatively. So poverty is greater, there's no facilities, there's poor quality schooling. The environment is not as urbanized, and it is a lot less acculturated than Gauteng is. And so, finding results like this tells us that when we deal with acculturated samples who are more similar to the kind of weird samples on whom the 5-factor studies and the neo studies were conducted, we do find the 5-factor replicates. But the more we go to cultures that are more traditional, cultures that still subscribe to some of the more indigenous African ways of being, the less the model replicates. And when we say African cultures that are more traditional, one of the things that comes across very strongly is the concept of Ubuntu, where Ubuntu is where a person is a person through other persons. That kind of emphasizes for us in a South African context the importance of community, of communal living, of relying on other people. And it does bring to the fore the whole individualism versus collectivism dimension. Such that, aside from what we found in this study with the NEO, we have found with the SEPI, when further analysis was done, that there was evidence for social relational personality concepts, where agreeableness would replicate, but there was in agreeableness, it was very similar to the agreeableness on the 5-factor model, but there was also a more social agreeableness, one that went hand in hand with communicating more with the community, with being accepted more in the community, doing more for the community. And this was similar to when Lehe did the study with the CPAI2 in the South African context, where we found those results would also support the interpersonal relatedness dimension that Chung and colleagues had with the CPAI2. Thelmayer also found similar results with the Kuku-Gawab language in Namibia. But what Amber Thelmayer and colleagues found was also around the importance of spirituality in traditional contexts, something that was also missing in the five-factor model. A study with the Neo-PI3 and individualism collectivism also found that individualism collectivism wouldn't load with any of the five factors. So there was support for another dimension. So yes, the five factors may be universal, but their expressions might differ. And evidence does exist for new factors, particularly something along a social relational, interpersonal relatedness, or communal element. And so the questions that we ask ourselves when concluding is, should this be a separate factor? Should there be a separate social relational factor? Or can this be subsumed in the big five? So given the loadings and given the variation in the facets, I would think it's more possible to incorporate some communal expressions of those facets and look at how that pans out in terms of the big five and the universality and replicability of the big five. I know there's a debate around whether what we're finding are culture-specific factors or whether they'll be universal. And I think the problem with that is because instruments like the South African Personality Inventory or the CPA-I2 haven't necessarily been tested in contexts outside Asia or Africa. So I think in terms of work going forward, we need to have majority world models tested in Western contexts. And as we're doing now, we need to have Western models tested more in majority world contexts to see to what extent they replicate and whether there are factors beyond the big five or whether we can actually have more communal expressions of the big five. So I think that's it from me. Nkosi, thank you, Nyabonga, Kalebocha, in all our official languages.